Welcome to the 21st century. My name is Errol Ford, your host for today's show. And living in the 21st century, we will be engaged in talking about serious issues that our climate is taking on at this time. In our studio today, we have with me Executive Director Julie Wamster. She's from the Boston Harbor Association. I want to welcome you here, and she will be speaking on climate change and the sea level rise in Boston. On my left hand, we have William Colon. He is from Springfield, a music producer who happened to overcome some disabilities, but want to express his concern also with climate change. I want to welcome you both here this evening to this new program, and hoping that we would have an enjoyable time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My first question to you, Julie, is to basically elaborate a little bit of climate change and the sea level rise in Boston, what threats it poses, and how can we deal with these threats as we move forward in this 21st century.
Yeah. Well, Boston is a special case, in part because our ancestors filled in a lot of land, or filled in a lot of ocean to make extra city.
Okay.
But because they were doing this in the 1800s, they were doing it with oxen and shovels, so they didn't want to do more effort than they had to.
Exactly.
And so a third of the city is not very far above high tide.
Okay.
So what scientists say is that we might see as much as 5 or 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So babies today might even see that.
Wow.
Yeah, and if we get that much sea level rise, today's very rare extreme flood, one that we've only seen a couple times in the last 150 years, that would be the twice daily high tide. So all of a sudden we'd be dealing with a whole lot more salt water. Up to a third of the city could flood every year if we don't do something. So of course we will do something, and it's a question of, will it take a disaster first, or can we plan ahead?
Well, this often bothers me sometimes, because I recognize that residents and those who live in, especially in the Boston area, they are not cautious to the fact that this consistent rise in sea level. And I'm just thinking, let's say we have a flash flood,
Yeah.
a serious flash flood, and both that flood and the sea collided together.
Mm-hmm.
What can you do to protect yourself? How can you really deal with something like that? Is government taking this serious?
Well, there's a couple really good questions in that. One is, what can we do? And the other is, is government doing something about it? So the good thing about Boston, unlike New Orleans was really like a bathtub. Once the levees broke, that water stayed in New Orleans. In Boston, that water will drain out to the ocean at some point. So the people who are really in danger are the very young, the very old, people with disabilities, and those people who love them and won't leave them, right?
Yes.
So a lot of what we need to do, if we have a big storm with a lot of rain and extra high tides today, is we need to know who's at risk, who can't just get up and leave, right? Because we've got good weather reports. We know what to do with a blizzard. We don't yet know what to do with a hurricane, right? We need to learn what to do as storms get more serious, but we need to know how to protect our neighbors. That's who's at risk today.
Yes. We have looked around in the past decade, and we would recognize there has serious tsunamis worldwide, and
Yep.
the reality is that we can never tell when we have massive amount of rainfall.
Yeah.
And I'm talking not only with the rain coming and causing flash floods, but
Yeah.
I'm also talking about in the event, as we know for a fact that the sea is consistently
Yes.
rising. When both collide together, the same way we think that this water may drain out towards the sea sea may very well come into us.
Yep.
And I see deep beyond the just protection of people, but what about our economy? Do this somewhat have a serious impact on the way how businesses will function? Because you can have massive floods, it will cause problems on insurance companies, it will cause problems on government, federal government trying to replace damaged properties. How can we best develop some solution now that weather is moving people out from certain low-lying areas and create different zoning ordinances? What do you think?
Boy, there's a lot of really good thoughts there. And what you were talking about in terms of how do we move people away from the places where they're most at risk, the people who know a lot about flooding is like Holland. Like the Netherlands, they've had flooding for centuries, right?
Yes.
Something like 70% of their population lives below sea level, so they're much worse off than we are today. And for centuries, they really relied on these really big levees to keep the water out. When Hurricane Katrina destroyed a big part of New Orleans, they said, wow, with sea level rise coming up, our levees are going to fail. We better get people out of the way. So they started to think about, instead of making these walls higher and higher and higher, are there things we can do to make people, like if it does flood so people don't get harmed? For example, maybe people shouldn't live on the first floor. Maybe people should start living on the second floor, and you park your cars on the first floor, or you have an open air place. Maybe you have stores on the first floor where everything can get moved up if you know a storm is coming.
Yes.
These things where you say, let's expect a flood to come. Let's not just cross our fingers or knock on wood and hope it doesn't come. Let's plan for it to come and see how, if the water comes in, it's not going to do harm.
Quite agree. A matter of fact, we should even take a page out of Holland's book. I think most of their houses now are built in a way that they can actually levitate off the water and
Some
suspend
of them
it.
can.
Some of them can.
They're floating.
Which is very creative.
Yeah.
So I think that because we don't have power over sea level rise or even flash flooding, we should think in modern ways of how we should think about building homes that in the event these things happen, which it will happen at some point, that we can be more secure in terms, rather than getting washed into the sea, we can probably sail into the sea.
That's right.
So that is one thing I think may be a good idea.
No, I think so. And so the things. So you asked a while back. What's the government doing? The reason that we don't know much about this yet is people tried to prevent climate change for a long time, and they thought that if we started to try to adapt for it, it was giving up. They're saying, "Oh, we're giving up on trying to prevent this." It was only when we had Hurricane Sandy really caused billions of dollars of economic damage to New York and New Jersey that people said, we can't prevent this. Some of the sea level rise, extreme storms you talked about, flash floods, and also heat waves is the third one. Some of that's happening already, and it's going to get worse. So it's only been in the last few years we've started to say, so how do we deal with it? And a lot of what we're doing is learning from countries that are already dealing with flooding, whether it's Bangladesh or Korea or the Netherlands. There's a lot of people who live in places where it's already flooding. We can learn from them. How do you deal with the heat? There are countries that have dealt with lots of heat. Boston hasn't yet, but we can learn from them. And I think the biggest thing is extreme weather is going to make the gap between rich and poor that much worse. So you look at February's blizzards. If people had a salary, they had good child care, they could work from home, there was very little property damage. Single parents with the schools closed and the T shut down, and they had a minimum wage hourly job, so they couldn't afford a taxi, that was economically devastating. And so the difference between rich and poor gets worse as all of this happens.
That's right.
And so a lot of what we have to think about is not just the buildings, but what are the changes in our social systems that help the most vulnerable. Because those are the folks who are going to get harmed first.
Definitely. That's correct. At this point, I want to just turn over to William. Now, William, tell us a little bit about yourself, not only as a music producer, but you also had expressed your concerns about climate change. Could you just elaborate a little?
All right. Well, I come from Springfield, Massachusetts, and things are, difficult out there. Let's say, I was born deaf, had surgery at 4, spoke around 4 or 5 years old, had a speech impediment till I was 13. Overcame all these obstacles, and I have twin daughters, identical girls now, and I wonder, like, because we're emitting, there's so much CO2 everywhere.
Yeah.
Plants aren't going to eat all this stuff. How fast we're producing it, How can I prepare my children to face these things if the government isn't going to help us?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. I have an 11-year-old daughter as well, and she already says to me, I wish that I'd been born earlier so I wouldn't have to deal with this. And it's sad. I mean, I think we're living into an unknown future. How hot is it going to get? Are we going to get drought? Are we going to get flooding? We know the sea level is going up. So you think about all those things we know already. If there's a big storm, shelter in place. If you're going to lose your job, try to have some savings. I think as the weather gets more volatile, the job market gets more volatile, people get more volatile. And I think that, again, it's not this, what's happening to us is not like aliens landing from Mars, right? They're extremes of what we know already. What do we do in a heat wave? What do we do in a drought? What do we do when there's too much rain or too much snow? They're just going to be bigger, is what it seems like, right?
Yeah, it just seems like everything's getting worse. Like, for example, tornadoes. In
Tornadoes in Massachusetts. I know, who knew?
Blew my mind. I woke up from a nap and I come outside and there's tornadoes everywhere, and I'm like,
what the heck? I know.
Do we live on flatlands? What's going on?
I know, and that's the thing that's so scary is we don't know yet what the extremes are, right? But I think one of the things that we can do is be humble and learn from folks who've already dealt with that. There's a tornado alley, I don't know, Kansas, Nebraska. What do they do? How do they have to make their homes different? There's Bangladesh gets flooded all the time because it's so low lying and it's the delta of the Ganges River. What do? They put their houses on stilts. What's the equivalent of a house on stilts when we have snow, right? What's our architecture going to look like? And I think the big thing is that because we're going to have to make a lot of change, it's going to cost money. The government's got to help us do this. It's not something that people can do just by ourselves.
Absolutely.
But there's a way to create jobs. There's a way to create, better, like everything. It has to be different. It doesn't have to be worse. So, for example, if you're like, okay, we have to build new housing that is drought resistant, heat wave resistant, storm resistant. How about building it next to public transportation? How about building it with jobs so people don't have to travel to jobs at all? How about, teach people how to do this new kind of construction so we, get a better local economy?
Absolutely.
If I could interject here for a second, though, what about those large industrialized organizations that have a very negative impact by destroying our
environment
and pollutants all over the air that contributing significantly to global warming?
Yeah.
How can we actually harness their hands or somewhat have them be more respectful to our climate change, to the problems that we are consistently facing with pollutants? What, in your opinion, should we do to make sure that this keep within compliance with certain government standards, that rather than we just prepare as individuals, organizations has an obligation to make sure that they stand up and do what is right for the benefit of humanity? What is your position on that?
It's kind of pessimistic, because I think that for those companies to do that job, they're driven by profit, right? For it to be profitable to do wind power or hydropower or renewable energy or solar, the government has to create regulations that make it more expensive or even illegal to use fossil fuels. And then the markets will change, and those companies will say, okay, I'm going to make more profit if I become a solar energy company instead of being ExxonMobil, right? Okay. But our government, the government level that has to do is the federal government.
Yes.
It's paralyzed right now. That's what's so discouraging. I feel like our local governments actually are pretty aware of this. I work within the city of Boston. The mayor of Boston he's doing a couple things. He called together the mayors of all the cities that touch Boston and said, we need to work together
Okay.
to prepare for climate change.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. And Boston just came out with a climate action plan to say, how do we reduce carbon dioxide emissions and how do we protect the population for
Yes.
climate change? And he also just got $1 million grant to make the city more resilient. And he said, you know what? Part of our resilience is social resilience. We need to come to grips with Boston's class and race divisions.
Yes.
And we need to pull people together, close that opportunity gap, and also close that vulnerability gap, right?
Great.
And so here's a great mayor. At the local level, I think we
Excellent.
can get things done.
Excellent.
I think of Newton as pretty strong on stuff like this.
Okay.
But Boston and Newton are not going to change ExxonMobil.
Exactly.
It's the federal government, you know, and
Exactly.
so what's discouraging is we got to get back to that place where our federal government works.
Absolutely.
That's what's discouraging,
Absolutely.
right?
Well, William, I want to ask you a question. Because you had exercised great concern before with young people, and I've known for a fact that you potentially, or you could be considering a potential candidate going on the Socioeconomic Development Foundation of Boston, Inc., to be a director in sports tourism and the performing arts. But how would you influence the younger generation as they aspire to achieve so many things, to be conscious-minded about what's going on in our natural environment when it comes to sea level rise or even air pollutants and industrialized nations?
I would have to say, pay attention. You know, look around you. It's all in front of you. You know, you look up, you see pollutants in the sky. You know, and I want to bring it to a level where I'm a source. You know, I've overcome a lot of things. I don't want it to be where people are getting something from someone else, and it keeps going down the ladder. I want to teach you how to do this yourself and be, you know, just survive or become successful or whatever it is that you got to do. But everything you have to realize that the world we live in, this is the biggest thing for us right now, you know? And if we're destroying it, how are we going to be able to live and be fruitful on it?
Okay.
You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that concern me also is that most young people today are somewhat blinded with the technology. And
Yeah.
do you think that they really care about climate change, whether the sea coming tomorrow and wash this planet away?
There's a saying, it's called ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, right.
And there's a lot of ignorant people out there. They're too busy looking at who's the next celebrity or what's going on TV, America's Got Talent, who knows what, soap operas.
Yes.
Nobody's really paying attention to what's going on anymore, you know? So you have to make it obvious to them in a way where it attracts the crowd, you know? And the millennial of this generation are very hard to reach. So the best way to do it, I would have to be is social. It would have to be like social media, TV, music, you know, activities.
Do you see a way where this could be possibly introduced into schools as a subject to be taught in order that they can be familiar with the circumstances surround them in the future, that they can be more positive in terms of treating the environment right, even speaking to their own city councilors and city representatives, etc., keeping them on their feet, making them aware of what's going on?
I mean, I would encourage it. It would be a great thing because it would stop, you know, it probably put a significant, you know, dent into polluting in itself, you know?
Okay.
If you teach people how not to pollute, how
Yes.
to recycle, how to throw stuff away, you know, that'd be great for schools, you know?
Okay.
It'll make it more energy efficient everywhere else too. Keep jobs going, you know, so if you could put that in a school and help the greater result, that'd be the best thing in my eyes.
Beautiful. And Julie, tell me what Boston Harbor Association presently is doing. I know obviously you're concerned with the sea level rise, but actively what your engagement is in terms of stimulating awareness of this consistent rise, and what you would think is the best route to take in the future.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Sure.
So we started in 1973 because Boston was the most polluted urban harbor in the country. So all the sewage from 43 towns and cities went right into the harbor without treatment. And if you put your hand just a few inches below the surface, you wouldn't be able to see your hand. If you fell in the harbor, you'd have to go to the hospital. So we started out trying to get that harbor cleaned up, advocating for it. You know, billions of dollars later and thousands of people later, it's the cleanest urban harbor in the country.
Wow.
Which is just
That's
a
amazing.
huge,
Yeah.
huge success. Halfway through that, we said, okay, we can't lose our access to the harbor because now people are going to want to build on it and close it off for themselves. So we worked on a 50-mile long, 12-foot wide park
Okay.
that allows people to go along all of Boston Harbor except for Logan Airport and the Coast Guard station. But other than that, everywhere, it's called the Harbor Walk.
Okay.
They said, okay, check, we're done with those two goals. What do we do now?
Mhm.
So now we're working to reconnect people with the harbor. So people my age and older, when we grew up, was like, this place is gross.
Okay.
We don't think to bring our kids there because we always knew it as polluted. So we're doing a lot of free programming
Beautiful.
to get
Beautiful.
people back to the
Beautiful.
harbor. The other thing we're doing is we want to keep the harbor out of the subway system, right?
Okay. Sure.
And so we've been working, particularly since Hurricane Sandy, to say, here are the neighborhoods that are going to flood first. And it's rich and poor. You know, there's some of the older neighborhoods are very low income because they were living next to a very polluted harbor. Some of the newer neighborhoods, once the harbor was cleaned up, got very high end economically.
Okay.
So it's all over the place in terms of who lives next to the harbor
Okay.
and who's at risk. So the first thing we did is we looked at we put out maps and said, here's who floods first when
Okay.
sea level rises.
Sure.
We then worked with the city on an international competition to say, if Boston had 5 feet more higher oceans, what would it look like? How could it be beautiful?
Okay.
Boston has to be different, but how could it be even better? And so there were architects from 7 different cities, and one of the winners was from Venice, because they
Okay.
know flooding, right? They
Yeah.
know beautiful
That's
flooding.
awesome. Yeah.
And the other 2 are from Boston, and they came up with really good ideas for how do we live with water? How do we not just barricade Boston and then the water still comes over the wall
Okay.
at some point, but how can we let it in ways that doesn't hurt people and things?
Mhm.
And now that we've learned all that, we're going to ground and working with neighborhoods and say, okay, neighborhood, you are at risk. What do you value?
Mhm.
What's going to get harmed if it floods? And what can we do about it together?
Okay.
And bringing those ideas back to the city government so that people, and again, what are those values that they want? Is it better transportation? Is it better housing? Is it better access to the water? What can we fix as we're dealing with more ocean? That's our goal. That's
Okay.
what we're involved in.
Well, I like the creativity in terms of keeping with other nations, in essence, to make the water level appear
Yes.
beautiful.
Yeah.
I believe it could also appear economical.
That's right.
With the Olympics around the corner, tell me what you think about it. Do you think Olympics coming to Boston is a good idea? What about economic impact? Do you think it's going to hurt?
Well, it depends how they do it, right? I mean, I
Okay.
think
Mhm.
because we haven't, the city's not had a plan for like what the city should be for 50 years.
Okay.
So in a sense, I feel kind of sorry for the Olympics
Okay.
because they're like, we're going to do this Olympics. They're like, well, here's all my hopes and dreams,
Okay.
right? Let's, put that on the Olympics. And they're saying, you got all these hopes and dreams, and we're supposed to break even economically.
Okay.
That's hard to
It's
do
very
both,
hard to do.
right?
Yes.
So in terms of sea level rise, the 2 places that they're looking, so the Olympic Village and Olympic Boulevard,
Okay.
happen to be in 2 of the most flood-prone parts of the city.
Okay.
Wow.
Right? And
Wow.
so they could be, if they decide to do the Olympics here, they could be a showcase for how to do
Okay.
it right,
Beautiful.
right?
Well, we have to take a wrap here, and I want to really thank you, Julie, from Boston Harbor Association, for coming with us and really explain a little bit about sea level rise in Boston. You surely make a positive impact, and you would certainly educate some of those folks out there who are not aware of what's going on. Also, William, I want to thank you very much as a music producer
Thank you.
and someone who had expressed interest also towards climate change. I want to thank you both for coming, and I hope that in the future you'll be here again. And for all those who are at home, audience, I want to thank you very much for joining in today for our first ever Living in the 21st Century. Stay tuned. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.